The cursed inbreeding house of Kentucky. Every child born carried the same inherited genetic mutation. This is not merely a title. This is a verdict written in flesh and bone, passed down through generations of a family that chose isolation over integration, blood over community, and paid a price that echoes through the Appalachian hills to this very day. In the autumn of 1967, a young county health worker named Margaret Ellen Hayes made her first official visit to a remote section of Harlan County, Kentucky. She had been assigned to document living conditions in the most isolated pockets of the region, part of President Johnson's War on Poverty initiative. What she discovered in a hollow known locally as Cripple Creek would haunt her for the rest of her professional life and eventually bring national attention to one of America's most disturbing cases of generational consanguinity. The Bledsoe family had lived in that hollow since before the Civil War. According to county records that Margaret would later unearth, the original patriarch Ezekiel Bledsoe had arrived in the region around 1847, fleeing debts and scandal from Virginia. He brought with him a wife, 2 daughters, and a burning distrust of the outside world that would become the defining characteristic of his descendants for over a century. The road to the Bledsoe property was barely a road at all. It was a dirt path carved into the mountainside, accessible only by mule or on foot during the wet months. Margaret had been warned by locals in the nearby town of Everts not to venture there alone. They spoke of the Bledsoes in hushed tones, calling them the Hollow People or simply those folks up the creek. When pressed for details, most would simply shake their heads and change the subject. Margaret was 24 years old, fresh from her training at the University of Kentucky, and filled with the idealistic belief that education and resources could lift any community out of poverty. She had no framework for what she was about to encounter. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came when she crossed the wooden bridge over Cripple Creek and saw a figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree line. It was a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, watching her approach with an expression that seemed somehow both curious and vacant. As Margaret drew closer, she noticed the child's features, a pronounced underbite, eyes set unusually close together, and fingers that seemed too short for the hands they were attached to. The child did not speak. It simply turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with an odd, shuffling gait that suggested some difficulty with coordination. Margaret continued up the path until she reached the Bledsoe homestead. What she found was not one house, but a cluster of 5 ramshackle structures arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing. Smoke rose from 3 of the chimneys. Chickens scratched in the dirt. And everywhere there were eyes watching her from doorways and windows. She counted 17 people that first day. 17 members of the Bledsoe family living in those 5 structures, ranging in age from infants to elderly. And among those 17, Margaret noted in her official report, at least 12 displayed visible physical abnormalities consistent with hereditary conditions. The family patriarch at that time was a man named Hosea Bledsoe, 63 years old according to county birth records, though he looked far older. Hosea was the great-grandson of Ezekiel, and he had never once left Harlan County. Neither had his father nor his grandfather. The Bledsoes had turned inward generation after generation until the family tree had become something more like a family knot. Hosea's wife, Della, was also his first cousin. His parents had been second cousins. His grandparents had been uncle and niece. This pattern of close family unions stretched back as far as anyone could remember, each generation tightening the genetic noose a little more. Margaret sat on the porch of Hosea's cabin that October afternoon, drinking weak coffee and trying to maintain her professional composure as family members drifted in and out of her field of vision. She saw children with clubbed feet. She saw adults with severe intellectual disabilities. She saw a teenage girl with a curved spine so pronounced she could not stand fully upright. And she saw again and again the same distinctive facial features, the close-set eyes, the receding chin, the low-set ears. The Bledsoes were polite but guarded. They answered her questions in monosyllables when they answered at all. Hosea did most of the talking, explaining that the family had always kept to themselves and always would. They grew their own food. They made their own clothes. They buried their own dead in a small cemetery on the hill behind the main cabin. They needed nothing from the outside world, and they wanted nothing from it either. But Margaret was trained to look beyond what people said to what they showed. And what the Bledsoes showed her was a community in crisis. The children were malnourished. Several adults displayed symptoms of untreated medical conditions, and the pattern of hereditary deformities suggested something that her textbooks had only mentioned in passing: the accumulated effects of multiple generations of consanguineous unions. She returned to Everett's that evening and immediately began researching the Bledsoe family history. What she found in the county courthouse records confirmed her worst suspicions. Marriage licenses, birth certificates, death records, all told the same story. The Bledsoes had been wedding their own kin for at least 4 generations. Cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. In at least 2 documented cases, half-siblings to half-siblings. The genetic consequences of such practices are well understood by modern science, though they were less clearly articulated in 1967, when closely related individuals produce offspring. Recessive genetic mutations that might otherwise remain dormant have a much higher chance of being expressed. 1 generation of such unions might produce no visible effects, 2 generations might produce subtle abnormalities, but 4, 5, 6 generations of continuous consanguinity can concentrate harmful mutations until they become virtually inevitable in every child born. The Bledsoes had reached that point. They had crossed a genetic threshold from which there was no return. Margaret's initial report to her supervisors in Frankfurt was met with skepticism. Surely she was exaggerating. Surely no American family in the 20th century could have maintained such extreme isolation. But Margaret had documentation. She had photographs. And she had the testimony of the few outsiders who had encountered the Bledsoes over the years. Traveling preachers, revenue agents during Prohibition, the occasional lost hunter. By the spring of 1968, a small team of medical professionals had been assembled to conduct a more thorough investigation of the Bledsoe family. What they discovered would shock the medical community and raise profound questions about isolation, poverty, and the limits of government intervention in private family matters. But that investigation would also trigger a chain of events that the Bledsoes themselves could never have anticipated. Events that would tear the family apart, expose their secrets to the world, and ultimately lead to one of the most controversial custody battles in Kentucky legal history. The hollow that time forgot was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming into the modern age. Confira sege inscrito nes canal. This story is only beginning to reveal its darkest secrets, and the families we investigate deserve witnesses who will see their truth through to the end. Subscribe now, because what comes next will change how you understand the hidden corners of American history. The medical team that arrived in Cripple Creek in April of 1968 consisted of 3 physicians from the University of Kentucky Medical Center, 2 social workers, and a geneticist named Dr. Harold Pemberton, who had spent his career studying hereditary conditions in isolated Appalachian. COMUNITIES. Dr. Pemberton was 61 years old. A soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for treating his research subjects with uncommon dignity. He would need every ounce of that dignity in the weeks ahead. The Bledsoes did not welcome the medical team. Hosea met them at the wooden bridge with a shotgun cradled in his arms, not pointed at them but not pointed away either. He listened to their explanations about free medical care and government assistance with an expression of profound distrust. Finally, after nearly an hour of negotiation, he allowed them to enter the hollow on one condition: they would examine only those family members who volunteered. They would take no one away, and they would leave before sundown each day. Dr. Pemberton agreed to these terms, though he knew they would severely limit the scope of his research. What mattered most was establishing trust. If the Bledsoes felt threatened, they would simply disappear deeper into the mountains as they had done before when outsiders came too close. Over the following 3 weeks, the medical team conducted examinations on 11 members of the Bledsoe family. The findings were consistent and devastating. Every individual examined displayed at least one significant hereditary abnormality. Most displayed several. The most common condition was a form of skeletal dysplasia that affected bone growth and development. This explained the shortened fingers Margaret had noticed on the child at the tree line, as well as the curved spines and unusual gaits observed throughout the family. The condition was not fatal in itself, but it caused chronic pain and limited mobility, making the already difficult life in the hollow even harder. But the skeletal abnormalities were only the beginning. The team also documented high rates of congenital heart defects, hearing impairments, and moderate to severe cognitive disabilities. Several family members showed signs of a rare metabolic disorder that affected their ability to process certain proteins, leading to developmental delays and behavioral problems if left untreated. Dr. Pemberton was particularly interested in a condition he observed in 4 of the children examined: a distinctive pattern of facial features combined with intellectual disability that suggested a specific genetic syndrome, without the advanced testing methods that would become available in later decades. He could not confirm his suspicions definitively, but his clinical notes from that period reveal his growing certainty that the Bledsoes were suffering from the accumulated effects of a single genetic mutation passed down and concentrated through generations of close family unions. The team's geneticist estimated that the coefficient of inbreeding among the youngest Bledsoe children was comparable to that of offspring from immediate family members. In genetic terms, these children carried the equivalent burden of mutations that would result from the closest possible family relations, even though the actual pedigree showed slightly more distant connections on paper. This was the cumulative effect of multiple generations of consanguinity. Even unions between first cousins could produce offspring with the genetic vulnerability of much closer relations. Perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery came on the team's final day in the Hollow. Dr. Pemberton was examining a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Beth, one of Hosea's granddaughters, when he noticed that her hearing loss was not congenital but progressive. She had been able to hear normally as an infant, according to her mother, but had gradually lost her hearing over the past 2 years. Dr. Pemberton recognized this pattern as consistent with a specific hereditary condition that, if caught early, could sometimes be slowed or managed with treatment. But Sarah Beth had never seen a doctor before that day. She'd never been to a hospital. She had never received any medical intervention of any kind, and now at 5 years old she was almost completely unable to hear, and the damage was likely irreversible. Dr. Pemberton sat with Sarah Beth for a long time after completing his examination. He taught her a few basic hand signs, which she picked up with remarkable speed. Her eyes, he noted in his report, were bright and curious despite her disability. She was clearly intelligent, clearly capable of learning, clearly deserving of every opportunity that other children her age took for granted. But she was a Bledsoe, and in Cripple Creek, that meant her opportunities were limited to what the Hollow could provide. The medical team's report, submitted to state health authorities in June of 1968, painted a grim picture of generational suffering. They documented the physical conditions they had observed. They outlined the genetic mechanisms that had produced those conditions. And they made a series of recommendations that would prove deeply controversial. Chief among these recommendations was a proposal to remove the youngest Bledsoe children from the Hollow and place them in foster care or state institutions where they could receive proper medical treatment and education. The team argued that leaving these children in the Hollow was tantamount to sentencing them to lives of preventable suffering. The parents, they suggested, were not capable of providing adequate care, and the continued pattern of consanguineous unions virtually guaranteed that future generations would suffer even more severe effects. This recommendation would spark a fierce debate about parental rights, government overreach, and the complex ethics of intervening in isolated communities. It would also bring the Bledsoe family to the attention of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers who would descend on Cripple Creek in the months ahead. But before any of that could happen, something else occurred that would change the trajectory of the Bledsoe story forever. Something that began with a scream in the night and ended with a shallow grave on the hillside cemetery. In the early morning hours of July 14, 1968, one of Hosea's daughters gave birth to her third child. The labor was difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours, and was attended only by the women of the family, as had been their tradition for generations. The child that emerged was alive but badly malformed, with physical abnormalities so severe that it could not survive without immediate medical intervention. There was no medical intervention available in Cripple Creek. The nearest hospital was over 30 miles away, accessible only by the rutted dirt road that became impassable after dark. And even if the family had been willing to seek outside help, which they were not, the child's condition was likely beyond what 1968 medicine could have addressed. The baby lived for 6 hours. It was buried before dawn in the family cemetery, in a grave marked only by a small wooden cross. No birth certificate was filed. No death certificate was issued. As far as official records were concerned, the child had never existed. But Margaret Ellen Hayes, who had maintained contact with a few sympathetic members of the Bledsoe family, learned of the birth and death within days, and she understood, perhaps better than anyone else involved in the case, what that small grave represented. It was not the first such grave in the Bledsoe cemetery, and unless something changed, it would not be the last. The story of the Bledsoe family might have remained a footnote in medical literature, known only to specialists and local historians, if not for a young journalist named Thomas Reardon. In the autumn of 1968, Reardon was working for a small newspaper in Lexington, hungry for a story that would launch his career. He found it in the medical team's report on the Bledsoes, which had been leaked to him by a sympathetic source in the state health department. Reardon's article, published in October of 1968 under the headline, "The Forgotten Hollow, A Kentucky Family's Century of Isolation," was picked up by wire services and reprinted in newspapers across the country. Within weeks, the Bledsoe family had become a national sensation, their story debated in living rooms and coffee shops from coast to coast. The public reaction was complex and often contradictory. Some readers expressed horror at the conditions in the Hollow and demanded immediate government intervention to protect the children. Others defended the Bledsoes' right to live as they chose, arguing that government interference in family matters was a dangerous precedent. Still others used the story to advance various political agendas, citing the Bledsoes as evidence of everything from the failure of Great Society programs to the dangers of rural poverty to the need for stricter marriage laws. The Bledsoes themselves became unwilling celebrities. Journalists and photographers made the difficult journey to Cripple Creek, hoping for interviews and images. Most were turned away at the wooden bridge by Hosea or one of his sons, who had grown increasingly suspicious and hostile toward outsiders. A few managed to take photographs from a distance, capturing grainy images of the ramshackle cabins and their reclusive inhabitants. These photographs became iconic, reproduced in newspapers and magazines throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. They showed children with visible deformities playing in the dirt. They showed adults with distinctive facial features staring suspiciously at the camera. They showed a world that seemed impossibly remote from the suburban prosperity that most Americans experienced. But the photographs also raised troubling questions about privacy, consent, and the ethics of exposing a vulnerable family to public scrutiny. The Bledsoes had not asked to become famous. They had not consented to having their images spread across the nation, and the attention they received was not uniformly sympathetic. Some commentators mocked the Bledsoes as backwards hillbillies, using their story to reinforce cruel stereotypes about Appalachian poverty. Others treated them as curiosities, objects of fascination rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The line between raising awareness and exploitation was often blurred, and the Bledsoes paid the price for that ambiguity. Meanwhile, the legal and political machinery that would determine the family's fate was grinding into motion. In November of 1968, the Harlan County Department of Social Services filed a petition in family court seeking custody of 7 Bledsoe children under the age of 12. The petition cited the medical team's findings and argued that the children were at immediate risk of harm due to medical neglect, inadequate living conditions, and the ongoing pattern of consanguineous unions within the family. The case was assigned to Judge William T. Crawford, a stern, conservative jurist who had presided over the Harlan County Family Court for nearly 2 decades. Judge Crawford was known for his skepticism of government intervention in family matters and his belief that parents, not the state, should have the primary responsibility for raising their children. But he was also known for his commitment to the law, and the evidence presented in the Bledsoe case was difficult to ignore. The custody hearing began in January of 1969 and lasted nearly 3 weeks. It was one of the longest and most contentious family court proceedings in Kentucky history, attracting national media attention and sparking protests from both supporters and opponents of the state's intervention. The prosecution presented a parade of expert witnesses, doctors, geneticists, social workers, all testifying to the dire conditions in the Hollow and the urgent need to remove the children from their family. They showed photographs of the children's medical conditions. They presented charts illustrating the family's complex genealogy and the genetic consequences of their marriage patterns. They argued that leaving the children in the Hollow was equivalent to condemning them to lives of preventable suffering. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney named James Holbrook, took a different approach. Holbrook argued that the Bledsoes, whatever their faults, loved their children and had cared for them to the best of their ability. He pointed out that removing the children from their family and placing them in state institutions could cause its own form of harm, severing bonds of affection and community that could not easily be replaced. He challenged the state's right to dictate how families should live and who they should be permitted to wed. Hosea Bledsoe himself testified on the final day of the hearing. It was the first time he had ever spoken publicly about his family, and his words carried a raw emotional power that surprised many observers. He spoke of his love for his children and grandchildren. He spoke of the traditions that had sustained his family through generations of hardship. And he spoke of his fear that the government would destroy everything his ancestors had built. When asked about the pattern of close family unions, Hosea was unapologetic. His people had always kept to their own, he said. It was their way, it was what they knew, and he did not believe that outsiders had any right to tell them otherwise. Judge Crawford issued his ruling on February 7, 1969. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. He ordered that 3 of the youngest Bledsoe children, including little Sarabeth with her progressive hearing loss, be removed from the hollow and placed in state care where they could receive medical treatment and education. But he allowed the remaining children to stay with their families, provided that the parents agreed to regular visits from social workers and medical personnel. He also issued a stern warning to the Bledsoe family. Any future unions between close family members, he declared, would be grounds for immediate removal of any children produced by such unions. The state had a compelling interest in preventing the birth of children with severe hereditary disabilities, and it would exercise that interest to the fullest extent of the law. The ruling was appealed by both sides and would wind its way through the Kentucky court system for years. But its immediate effect was to tear apart a family that had survived intact for over a century. If you've been following this story closely, you understand the weight of what these families endured. In the comments below, write these words: "Their pain deserves to be remembered." This simple act connects you to all who witness these forgotten histories. Your voice matters here. On the day that social workers arrived to take Sarabeth and her 2 young cousins from the hollow, the scene was one of devastating grief. Mothers wailed. Children clung to each other. Even Hosea, the stoic patriarch, was seen wiping tears from his weathered face. The 3 children were loaded into a state vehicle and driven away from the only home they had ever known, toward an uncertain future in a world they could scarcely comprehend. Sarabeth would never see her mother again. The 3 Bledsoe children removed from the hollow in 1969 were placed in separate foster homes across eastern Kentucky. This decision, made by social workers who believed that separating the children would help them assimilate into mainstream society, would prove to be both a mercy and a cruelty. Sarabeth, now 6 years old and almost entirely without hearing, was placed with a family in Prestonsburg, about 60 miles from Cripple Creek. Her foster parents, Earl and Martha Combs, were middle-aged, childless, and deeply religious. They had volunteered to take in special needs children as part of what they saw as their Christian duty, and they approached Sarabeth's care with a mixture of compassion and determination. The first months were extraordinarily difficult. Sarabeth did not understand why she had been taken from her family. She did not understand the strange house with its indoor plumbing and electric lights. She did not understand the people around her whose lips moved in patterns she could not decipher. She retreated into herself, spending hours staring out the window in the direction of the mountains she could no longer see. But Martha Combs was patient. She learned sign language alongside Sarabeth, and gradually a means of communication developed between them. She enrolled Sarabeth in a school for children with hearing impairments in Lexington, where the girl began to receive the education and therapy that had been impossible in the hollow. And slowly, painfully, Sarabeth began to adapt to her new life. The other 2 children fared less well. A boy named Ezra, 8 years old, was placed with a family in Hazard who had little experience with children with special needs. His behavioral problems, likely related to the untreated metabolic disorder that Dr. Pemberton had suspected, proved more than his foster family could handle. He was moved to a state institution within a year, where he would spend the remainder of his childhood in conditions that were, in many ways, worse than those he had left behind in the hollow. The 3rd child, a girl named Delilah, who was only 4 when she was removed, was placed with a succession of foster families over the following decade. Her physical disabilities made her difficult to care for, and each family eventually requested that she be placed elsewhere. By the time she reached adulthood, Delilah had lived in 7 different homes and 2 institutions. She never formed lasting bonds with any caregiver, and she never stopped mourning the family she had lost. Back in Cripple Creek, the Bledsoes who remained tried to continue their lives as before, but the removal of the 3 children had broken something essential in the family's spirit. Hosea, who had always been the pillar of strength for his clan, fell into a deep melancholy from which he never fully recovered. He died in the spring of 1973, officially of pneumonia, though those who knew him believed he had simply lost the will to live. The pattern of consanguineous unions continued despite Judge Crawford's warning. In the isolation of the hollow, far from the eyes of social workers and courts, the Bledsoes did what they had always done. They kept to their own. Yes. They wedded their kin, and they buried their stillborn and short-lived children in the hillside cemetery, adding small wooden crosses to the growing collection of unmarked graves. But the outside world was not done with the Bledsoes. In 1974, a graduate student in anthropology from the University of Kentucky received permission to conduct an extensive study of the family for her doctoral dissertation. Over the course of 2 years, she lived intermittently in the hollow, documenting the family's customs, beliefs, and social structure. Her dissertation, completed in 1976, remains the most comprehensive academic study of an isolated consanguineous community in American history. The researcher, whose name was Dr. Linda Ferris, after she received her degree, painted a nuanced portrait of the Bledsoes that challenged many of the assumptions that had shaped public perception of the family. She found that the Bledsoes were not ignorant of the consequences of their marriage patterns. They understood, on some level, that their children suffered because of the closeness of their unions. But they also believed that their isolation was necessary for their survival, that the outside world was hostile and dangerous, and that the only people they could truly trust were their own bloodkin. Dr. Ferris also documented the religious beliefs that had developed within the family over generations. The Bledsoes practiced a form of Christianity that was unique to their hollow, incorporating elements of mainstream Protestant doctrine with folk traditions and beliefs that had been passed down from their earliest ancestors. They believed that their isolation was ordained by God, that their suffering was a test of faith, and that they would be rewarded in the afterlife for their endurance. These beliefs provided comfort but also reinforced the patterns of behavior that were destroying the family from within. When children were born with severe disabilities, the Bledsoes interpreted these conditions as divine trials rather than preventable tragedies. When children died young, they were mourned but also celebrated as souls released from earthly suffering. The theology of the hollow had evolved to accommodate and even sanctify the consequences of consanguinity. By the early 1980s, the Bledsoe family had dwindled significantly. Deaths had outpaced births for over a decade. Young people who might have continued the family line had either died from hereditary conditions, been removed by the state, or fled the hollow seeking a different life. The few who remained were aging, infirm, and increasingly unable to maintain the subsistence lifestyle that had sustained the family for generations. The last patriarch of the Bledsoes was a man named Josiah, Hosea's youngest surviving son. Josiah was 47 in 1982 and displayed many of the characteristic physical features that marked his family: the close-set eyes, the shortened fingers, the slight curve of the spine. But he also possessed a sharp intelligence and a wary awareness that the old ways could not continue indefinitely. In the summer of 1982, Josiah made a decision that would have been unthinkable to his father or grandfather. He contacted Dr. Ferris, who had maintained a distant but cordial relationship with the family since completing her dissertation, and asked for her help. He wanted to know if there was any way to break the pattern, to give the children of the hollow a chance at healthier lives without abandoning everything his ancestors had built. Dr. Ferris arranged for Josiah to meet with genetic counselors at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. What followed was a series of conversations that laid bare the full scope of the Bledsoe tragedy. The counselors explained, in terms that Josiah could understand, exactly how the genetic damage had accumulated over generations and what it would take to reverse the trend. The answer was simple but devastating. The Bledsoes needed to stop wedding their own kin. They needed to introduce new genetic material into the family line. They needed to do exactly what their entire culture and history had forbidden. Josiah listened to the counselor's advice with a heavy heart. He knew that what they proposed would mean the end of the Bledsoes as his family had always understood themselves. They would no longer be a people apart, bound by blood and isolation. They would become like everyone else, scattered and diluted and eventually forgotten. But he also knew that the alternative was extinction. Not just the extinction of the family name, but the extinction of the family itself. One stunted generation at a time, until only the graves remained. Josiah Bledsoe's attempt to reform his family's marriage practices met with fierce resistance from the older members of the clan. His own mother, still living at 83 years old, refused to speak to him for months after learning of his consultations with outside doctors. His aunts and uncles accused him of betraying everything the Bledsoes stood for. And his own wife, who was also his first cousin, could not understand why he wanted to change traditions that had sustained their people for over a century. But Josiah persisted. He had seen too much suffering. He had buried too many small bodies in the hillside cemetery, and he had watched Sarabeth, the little girl with the bright, curious eyes, be taken away to a world he could never enter. He did not want that fate for the children who remained. In 1983, Josiah took an action that scandalized the entire hollow. He arranged for his eldest daughter, a girl of 16 named Rachel, to attend high school in Everts, the nearest town. It was the first time in recorded history that a Bledsoe child had received formal education outside the family. Rachel would live with a distant cousin who had left the Hollow years earlier and had established a relatively normal life in the town. Rachel's experience in Everett's was difficult. She was behind her classmates academically, having received only sporadic homeschooling in the Hollow. She was socially awkward, unfamiliar with the customs and expectations of mainstream teenage life, and she carried the visible marks of her heritage, the distinctive facial features, the shortened fingers, the slight limp from a leg that had never formed quite correctly. But Rachel was also resilient, intelligent, and determined to make the most of the opportunity her father had given her. She studied hard. She made a few cautious friendships. And by the time she graduated in 1985, she had been accepted to a community college in Hazard, where she would study nursing. Rachel would never return to live in the Hollow. She would eventually marry a man from outside the family, a construction worker she met in Hazard named David Wilson. Their children, born in the late 1980s and early 1990s, showed none of the hereditary conditions that had plagued the Bledsoes for generations. The curse, if it could be called that, had been broken in Rachel's line. But the Hollow itself continued to decline. By 1990, only 7 Bledsoes remained in Cripple Creek. Josiah, his wife, his mother, 2 elderly aunts, and 2 younger family members who had been too severely disabled to leave. The cabins were falling apart. The gardens were overgrown. The cemetery on the hill had more occupants than the living community below it. Josiah died in 1994 of heart failure, one of the hereditary conditions that had run in his family for generations. His passing marked the end of an era. The remaining Bledsoes, too old or too infirm to maintain the Hollow on their own, were eventually moved to care facilities in the surrounding counties. The last of them, Josiah's ancient mother, died in 1997 at the age of 98. The Bledsoe Hollow was abandoned, the cabins collapsed, the forest reclaimed the clearings. The cemetery, with its dozens of small wooden crosses, was gradually obscured by undergrowth until only those who knew where to look could find it. And what of the children who had been scattered? What of Sarabeth and Ezra and Delilah and all the others who had been removed from their families in the name of protection? Sarabeth Bledsoe, the little girl with the progressive hearing loss, graduated from the Kentucky School for the Deaf in 1981. She went on to earn a degree in special education and spent her career helping other children with hearing impairments. She never spoke publicly about her origins, but she kept a photograph of her mother on her dresser until the day she died. In 2019, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew nothing of Cripple Creek, Ezra, the troubled boy who had been institutionalized, did not fare as well. He spent most of his adult life in various care facilities, his behavioral problems never adequately addressed or treated. He died in 1998 at the age of 37, officially of pneumonia, though those who knew his history suspected that years of inadequate care had simply worn his body down. Delilah, the youngest of the 3 children removed in 1969, struggled throughout her life with the physical and emotional consequences of her heritage. She never married. She never held steady employment. She lived on disability payments in a small apartment in Lexington where she died alone in 2008. Her body was not discovered for 3 days. Rachel Wilson, Josiah's daughter who had broken free of the Hollow, lived to see her grandchildren grow up healthy and strong. She rarely spoke of her childhood, but in her final years, she began to write down her memories, hoping to preserve some record of the family that had shaped her. Her memoir, never published, remains in the possession of her descendants, a private testament to a vanished world. The Bledsoe story is in many ways a uniquely American tragedy. It is a story of isolation and poverty, of government intervention both too late and too clumsy, of a family that tried to preserve itself and ended up destroying itself instead. It is a story without clear heroes or villains, only human beings making choices within constraints they barely understood. But it is also a story with lessons for our own time. The forces that created the Bledsoe tragedy, the poverty, the isolation, the distrust of outsiders, the intergenerational transmission of harmful patterns, these forces have not disappeared. They have merely taken new forms in communities across America and around the world. Wherever people find themselves cut off from the resources and connections that allow families to thrive, the Hollow is empty now. The cabins have rotted into the forest floor. The cemetery is hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and tangled vines. But the story of the Bledsoes endures, a warning and a testament to the terrible price that isolation can exact, not just on individuals, but on entire lineages, stretching across generations into a future that was never allowed to arrive. If you watched until this moment, you have witnessed a story that many would prefer to remain buried. You have seen the human cost of isolation, the weight of genetic legacy, and the impossible choices faced by those who tried to help and those who tried to survive. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and recognize who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already. Every subscriber ensures that these forgotten histories continue to be told, that the silent graves and hollows like Cripple Creek are not entirely forgotten. Leave a like to show that this story mattered to you. Share this video with someone who values truth over comfort, who understands that the past, however dark, deserves to be remembered. The Bledsoe Hollow may be gone, but as long as their story is told, the people who lived and suffered there are not entirely lost to history. This has been the cursed Inbreeding House of Kentucky. Every child born carried the same inherited genetic mutation, and now you know why.